The morning air over England was cold enough to bite through a flight jacket, and the runway at Debden lay under a thin veil of mist. A young pilot tightened the straps across his shoulders, hearing only the muted rumble of engines warming somewhere down the flight line. He was moments away from a choice few men had ever faced, a flight straight into the heart of a fortress the world believed was unreachable. No one dared say it aloud, but the tension settled over the airfield, like a weight this mission was not supposed to be possible. For years, American bombers had flown deep into German territory and returned shattered. Their gunners outmatched their escorts, forced to turn back long before the danger truly began. The air war over Europe was bleeding men faster than replacements could arrive, and every failed mission pressed the Allies closer to a breaking point. Berlin remained a distant and untouchable shadow, protected by the confidence of German commanders, who believed no long-range escort fighter on Earth could reach it. Berlin remained a distant and untouchable shadow, protected by the confidence of German commanders who believed no long-range escort fighter on Earth could reach it. But on this day, a new shape stood on the ramp, lean, silver, and quiet in its confidence. A machine the Germans insisted could not exist. The P-51 Mustang. What happened next would rewrite the mathematics of survival and the future of the war itself. The story of the P-51 Mustang cannot be understood without first stepping into the desperate months that came before it. Throughout 1943, American bomber crews crossed the English coast, knowing that large portions of the mission would be flown alone, unprotected, and exposed to the waiting claws of Luftwaffe fighters. They called those stretches of sky the lonely miles, a quiet name for a deadly truth. When the last friendly escort turned back, the bombers pressed on their formations, tightening as if closeness alone could shield them from what came next. German controllers had studied the limitations of every American fighter in service. They knew exactly where escort range ended, and at that invisible line the hunting began. Waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s broke through the high clouds and tore into the formations with ruthless precision. In the worst of these assaults over Schweinfurt, over Stuttgart, over the industrial heart of the Reich, dozens of bombers fell in a single day. For the men inside those aluminum fuselages, the air war over Europe became a test of endurance, more than strategy, a battle fought not only with guns, but with the slow rising fear that help would never arrive. The Allies understood the stakes. If deep penetration attacks collapsed the entire bombing campaign, the only means of striking at the German war machine before D-Day would fail. Without daylight pressure on factories, refineries, and railways, the enemy would recover, rebuild, and bleed Allied ground forces when the invasion finally came. The problem was painfully simple. The bombers could fly to the target. Their escorts could not. Thunderbolts lacked the reach. Lightning struggled in the cold. Even the RAF's Spitfire, legendary in its own right, was tied to the short distances of the Channel front. What the Allies needed was something no one had yet engineered: a long-range escort fighter that could travel hundreds of miles into German airspace fight, protect the bombers, and still return home. German intelligence insisted such an aircraft was impossible. Yet the roots of the answer had already been planted. North American aviation's early Mustang, designed in a whirlwind of wartime urgency, had shown glimpses of something extraordinary: long legs, clean aerodynamics, and fuel efficiency unmatched by other single-engine fighters. It was held back only by the Allison engine, whose power faded in the thin air where bombers flew. Then came the insight that changed everything. What if this nimble airframe, already a natural at conserving fuel, were paired with a high-altitude engine capable of sustaining power above 20,000 feet? Rolls-Royce engineers believed the Merlin could unlock the aircraft's full potential, and when the prototypes roared to life, the transformation was undeniable. Speed climbed ceiling, all surged upward. And more importantly, its range stretched far beyond expectations. In that moment, the foundation was laid for the aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe's certainty and escort bombers deep into Germany. The machine that would make Berlin bombing raids survivable. The machine that would soon be known across Europe as the P-51 Mustang. When the redesigned P-51 Mustang finally entered combat in late 1943, the shift was subtle. At first, a deeper penetration into France. Here is a successful escort run to the German coast there. But to the men studying the charts inside 8th Air Force headquarters, those early missions hinted at something larger. For the first time, a single-engine fighter was matching the distance flown by the bombers. And each time the Mustangs returned, their fuel gauges proved the calculations were real. A door long bolted shut was beginning to open. Major General James Doolittle saw it immediately. If the Allies were to win the air war over Europe, they needed to do more than protect the bombers. They needed to break the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. That meant forcing German pilots into battle again and again until the veteran corps was gone. Only a long-range escort fighter like the Mustang could remain with the bombers long enough to make those fights unavoidable. But aircraft alone never win wars. They require people willing to stretch their limits, and no one embodied that, more than Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group. When ordered to convert his unit from Thunderbolts to Mustangs, a transition that normally required weeks, Blakesley answered with the promise he would have the group combat ready in 24 hours. His pilots, veterans of Spitfires and P-47s, learned the cockpit layout on the way to their missions. His ground crews worked through the night by flashlight hands raw from cold metal and safety wire. And when the sun rose, the 4th Fighter Group took off in their new aircraft, each man knowing the next mission would be unlike any they had flown. The test came almost immediately, the first Berlin bombing raids with full escort. The plan was audacious. Fighters would fly ahead, above and around the bombers, forming a moving shield that stretched nearly 70 miles long. As the formations crossed into Germany, contrails appeared in the distance, thin white scars on the blue that marked the arrival of Luftwaffe fighters. The German pilots were climbing fast, preparing to dive through the bomber stream as they had done for years. This time they found Mustangs waiting. The first attack began near 10,000 meters. Blakesley's voice crackled across the radio. Here they come. In moments, the sky dissolved into motion. Spiraling turns, diving streaks of sunlight on aluminum wings, the sudden flash of tracers crossing paths. Mustang pilots turned into the enemy, tightening formation around the bombers. Bf-109s rolled into head-on attacks, but were met by interceptors that could finally match their energy. FW-190s dove through the clouds only to find P-51s in pursuit, the fight extending all the way down to the haze below. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe realized this was no longer the familiar battlefield they had dominated. The escorts weren't turning back, they weren't thinning out. They were growing stronger the farther into Germany they flew. And high above Berlin, as bombs began to fall through the flak-scarred air, it became clear that the P-51 Mustang had done the impossible. It had carried the war all the way to the Nazi capital and was ready to bring its crews home again. The first escorted raids into Berlin stunned German commanders, but the true breaking point followed only days later. On March 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe committed everything. It had veterans pulled from other fronts, reserve units rushed into service, entire fighter wings thrown into the sky in a desperate attempt to crush the American advance. To them, this was the moment to prove that the earlier raid had been a fluke, that a single-engine long-range escort fighter could not possibly endure the full weight of Germany's air defense. What unfolded instead became known as Black Monday. As more than 350 Luftwaffe fighters converged on the bomber stream, the German plan shifted. Rather than attacking the bombers directly, they targeted the escorts. If the P-51s could be scattered or destroyed, the bombers would once again be exposed. It was a brutal logic, and for a brief moment, the sky over central Germany became a tangled arena where survival depended on instinct, discipline, and sheer nerve. The P-51 Mustang pilots met the assault head-on. Major James Goodson broke into an enemy formation, destroying 2 aircraft in seconds. Captain Don Gentile and Lieutenant John Godfrey executed tight, aggressive maneuvers that turned German dives into traps. Across the entire defensive screen, similar engagements unfolded. Mustangs diving, climbing, rolling, always positioning between the attackers and the bomber stream behind them. Even when outnumbered, the P-51's energy retention and stability allowed pilots to stay in the fight longer than anything the Germans had faced. But Black Monday carried a heavy cost. 69 bombers fell that day, their wreckage scattered across fields and forests. 11 American fighters were lost. Yet the Luftwaffe lost far more, at least 66 fighters destroyed, many flown by irreplaceable veterans. In the air, war over Europe, this kind of attrition was lethal. Germany could build new aircraft, but it could not manufacture experience fast enough to match the losses. What followed in the days after was not just tactical defeat, but psychological collapse. German aces who had once ruled the sky, men like Gunther Rau and Johannes Steinhoff, returned from combat shaken. They reported being shadowed through turns they had once used to escape, pursued down to the treetops, and caught in dives they believed were safe. One after another, they reached the same conclusion. The Allies had solved the range problem. The escorts were no longer turning back. Every mission would now be a fight from start to finish. As Berlin bombing raids continued, the German system began to unravel. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 200 hours of flight time, a fraction of what was needed for high-altitude combat. Synthetic fuel plants were burning. Transportation networks were fractured. Airfields across Germany suffered repeated strafing attacks where P-51s destroyed the fighters on the ground faster than they could be repaired. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force, once feared across the continent, had been hollowed out. And at the center of that transformation stood the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that turned German certainty into despair and shifted the balance of the war. From Washington to London, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang was recognized as far more than a technical improvement. It was a strategic turning point. To American commanders who had watched bomber crews fall in horrific numbers, the Mustang represented something rare in war, a solution equal to the scale of the problem. General Henry Hap Arnold called its appearance over Germany one of the great miracles of the conflict, a quiet admission that without a true long-range escort fighter, the daylight bombing campaign might have collapsed entirely. Inside 8th Air Force headquarters, analysts charted the numbers with a mixture of relief and astonishment. Bomber loss rates once catastrophic fell sharply. Targets once considered unreachable, the Ruhr, Leipzig, and eventually the Nazi capital itself now lay within operational range. The air war over Europe was shifting not because the bombers were stronger, but because the skies around them had finally been secured by an aircraft designed to fly farther, fight longer, and bring its pilots home. Across the Channel, British commanders saw the Mustang as a reinforcement of a strategy they had pursued since the Battle of Britain controlled the air and you control the future. The RAF had proven that fighters could stop an invasion. Now the Americans were proving that fighters could dismantle an empire. The Berlin bombing raids, once symbols of Allied vulnerability, became demonstrations of a new reality. Germany could no longer shield its industrial heartland. In Berlin, the reaction was starkly different. Goering and his staff searched the wreckage of downed Mustangs, convinced the Americans had deployed some hidden technology. Their engineers found nothing revolutionary, just clean aerodynamics, disciplined fuel management, and a design that quietly prioritized range from the beginning. The shock was not simply that American fighters had reached Berlin. It was that they could do it again and again, draining the strength of Luftwaffe fighters every time they appeared. Other nations watching from afar drew their own conclusions. Allied planners understood that the Mustang validated a universal truth of modern warfare: mobility and reach matter more than raw power alone. Neutral observers recognized that Germany's presumed dominance in the air had been an illusion sustained by geography. Once that advantage disappeared, so did the Luftwaffe's ability to influence events on the ground. In the end, the P-51 Mustang did more than escort buyers. It reshaped strategic thinking across continents, proving that in a conflict as vast as World War II, the side that can reach the farthest often decides how and when the war will end. When historians look back at the great turning points of the Second World War, they often focus on the beaches, the cities, the armies that clashed on the ground. But some of the most decisive moments unfolded far above them in thin, freezing air where oxygen was scarce and decisions were measured in seconds. It was there, high above a wounded continent, that the P-51 Mustang quietly altered the direction of history. The Mustang did not win because it was the fastest aircraft or the most heavily armed. It won because it could be there over the Ruhr, over Leipzig, and finally over the Nazi capital, when no other Allied fighter could. By solving the range problem, it solved the strategic problem. Every successful escort run weakened the core of Luftwaffe fighters. Every return flight proved that the long-feared deep raids could be sustained. And every reduction in bomber losses allowed the Allied offensive to continue pressing inward, dismantling Germany's ability to wage modern war. In the long memory of the air war over Europe, the Mustang's legacy extends beyond performance statistics or battlefield victories. It transformed how nations thought about air power. Military planners learned that a true long-range escort fighter is not a luxury, it is a prerequisite for any campaign that seeks to strike deep and return alive. That lesson shaped the design philosophy of generations of fighters that followed, all tracing their lineage back to a machine that once defied German intelligence reports. But its greatest legacy may be written in quieter moments. In the faces of bomber crews who once flew into Germany believing they would never return, and who looked out their windows to see silver wings sliding into formation beside them. In the hands of ground crews who worked through rain and darkness, so those same aircraft would be ready at dawn. And in the memory of pilots who carried the weight of 6-hour missions, knowing that a single mistake could leave them alone over hostile territory. In the end, the Berlin bombing raids succeeded not simply because of machinery, but because ordinary men, engineers, mechanics, strategists, and pilots refused to accept the limits placed before them. As you reflect on this story, consider the larger question it raises. What lessons from that distant sky still matter today? And how often do we underestimate the power of solving the right problem at the right time? If this chapter of history speaks to you, I invite you to share your thoughts or stories in the comments. And if you value remembering moments that shaped our world, consider joining us for the next journey into the past. The war may have ended long ago, but the legacy of the P-51 Mustang still flies.